Great. And with that, we'll get it kicked off. Welcome, everyone, to the October ITMM COI meeting. My name is Daniel York. I'm the Director of IT Data Transparency here within GSA. I'm the Government Chair, Mr. Stu.
Hi, I'm Stu Hammer, and I'm the Industry Chair. Looking forward. Thank you for everybody joining this month on our very exciting panel around digital transformation. So, and I want to thank our panelists, especially for taking time for us and our committee. So I think it's good. Turn it back over to you, Erica.
Sounds great. So just to give a little bit of background, over the past several weeks, our committee has been working on a digital transformation case study project. And we're in the middle of analyzing all those results, and we'll be publishing a report and actually have some time on the schedule at Imagination in November. And in talking with the other folks on the team, we started thinking about, okay, who would be great to have at an October event, because we wanted representation from federal, from state and local, and from industry. And these four folks just really kind of stood out to us. I think you'll see that they have some really interesting insight. There's a lot of overlap too, a lot of common themes that you'll see. So without further ado, I wanted to welcome our folks and have them introduce themselves a bit. We have Darryl Peak. He's the head of federal strategic partnerships at Google. And then before that, I'm gonna steal probably a little bit of your thunder, was the director of digital innovation and solutions in the office of the OCIO, U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Darryl, do you want to maybe share a little bit about your journey?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for the.
I think you're.
Darryl, I think we lost you.
Yeah, I think you may have froze there.
For
There he's back.
Oh, no.
We lost you, Darryl. Can you start over? I'm so sorry.
No worries. Actually, Erica, I'm going to switch to my phone. Can you start with Edward or Sarah, and I'll come right back on?
Absolutely. Yeah. We also have Eddie Hartwig. He's the acting administrator of the White House U.S. Digital Services.
Hey everyone. I'm not the acting administrator at U.S. Digital Service anymore, because there's a new administrator named Mina Shun, who's a really fantastic colleague and exciting to see her take that role. But I think, technically still the deputy administrator at the United States Digital Service, although I am on a bit of a sabbatical for a moment. But I'm really excited to be here and to meet all of you. Yeah, thank you.
And Sara Hall, we've got from the City of Philadelphia, User Experience Practice Lead, Office of Innovation and Technology.
Hey everyone, as Erica mentioned, my name's Sara Hall. I have been with the City of Philadelphia for about 4.5 years, starting off as a product manager for Phila.gov. We built on a very, very intensive site redesign, bringing everyone from an old platform to a new platform, but also redesigning the way our residents interact with the site, providing information through multiple portals and pathways. And in December of 2019, we moved into OIT. And now we not only work on the website, because the website's always growing and needs to continue to grow, but also working on applications. And we're working on bringing in applications that vendors have previously been awarded and building them in-house with our software engineering and content strategy teams within OIT.
And we've also got Anthony Rodgers from the state of Michigan.
Hi, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. So I work with directly for the Chief Technology Officer at the state, and we've recently kind of rebranded ourselves, taking a leaf out of the GSA book as Technology Transformation Services. And really what we're trying to do is create a state version of the 18F team. We're actually working on a prospective engagement with 18F to sort of skill ourselves up to something approaching their level in terms of technology transformation. So we're really trying to bend the arc of technology acquisition at the state towards the goals of a digital service, and modernization, all the good stuff that 18F sort of promotes. And I particularly want to give a hot tip to Ed. At the US Digital Service, we take a lot out of the digital service playbook as we try and evangelize those principles at the state. It's not always easy, but we keep trying. So that's what we're about.
Excellent. Darryl, back to you.
Yeah, sorry about that. So Darryl, head of federal strategic partnerships at Google Cloud. I've been here for a year. I primarily am responsible for partnerships with system integrators as well as technology partners, and also working closely with our engineering as well as our sales team. So as far as my experience, I've been out of government for roughly 3 years. Previously, I was at Salesforce, and prior to that, I was at the Department of Homeland Security, responsible for digital innovation, which included not only technology exploration, our shared services, and also technology advisory services. So really excited to be here today to join this impressive panel, and looking to provide some insights I learned along the way.
Thank you so much. So I have a couple of questions, and we'll also open it up to the audience. So if you have any and all questions, please do put them into the chat window. And if it's specific for one of our panelists, let us know as well. So Sara, let's start with you. Some of the stuff that the city is doing is really interesting around designing services for users that account for facts like accessibility, equity. Can you speak to that a little bit? I found that to be really fascinating.
Yeah, of course. And I can speak directly to kind of the website and the applications that we've been working on. A foundation that was instilled prior to me coming on, I came in 2017, was really making sure that not only is the site accessible to everyone from a visual and, access kind of. So when we talk about access, meaning that we're not putting huge images on, so we're wasting everyone's data. Folks who can, when you access the website on a digital device versus your laptop versus a huge screen, you have the ability to experience it all the same. And then also making sure that it's understandable from a literacy perspective. Our content strategy team works really, really hard on working with department partners and writing everything in plain language. And I think that we've built a really, really good backbone to building the site out and implementing a lot of these changes. And with the changes in leadership over the past few years, they've really supported us, meaning that the chief CIO, Mark Wheeler, makes a really big, he finds extreme value in human-centered design and making sure that things are accessible. And that support from the top has really, really kind of concreted our existence in the digital space. So that's been really helpful when I speak to other cities and other organizations around what UX means, or design, or human-centered design, or at least a part of digital transformation means. I think it's making sure that you're advocating for that, but also breaking it down to things that are understandable, because the cities and these structures have existed for so long. We're working with subject matter experts, and they are really the experts who know what our residents and people who use the site need. So making sure that they actually understand what we're doing, but also we understand what they're doing. So we're not just plopping a solution on whatever they might need, is really, really important to think through.
I love that. And human-centered design is something that I think everyone on this panel has touched on in the past. Would anyone like to jump in and kind of share their perspective on human-centered design and how you've used it?
Sure. Again, I mean, I will just say that, like, I think that Sara is right on. I think that a lot of what people talk about when it comes to digital modernization is about cool tech, like blockchain and AI. And I can argue, I think somewhat convincingly, that there's not really a place for any of that in the work that I do every day. Like, this is about, the gold standard for USDS is can you access it from a library computer with a dial-up connection? And can you complete the process that you're trying to get through in under 10 minutes? Because that's a lot of the access point for people who access government services. And more importantly, if you build for that standard, you are inclusive of the rest of the group, right? The person with the Pixel phone can access it too, right? But you need to make sure that you can get to people that don't have landlines in their home, right? And so two-factor authentication, sometimes people use their landline and not their cell phone to access. And so how do we build these things in to the services we provide? Like that's actually true access, which is really actually the real modernization, which is just getting off of paper and making it so that people don't have to drive hours or take a day off of work to go and access some counter somewhere. That's really where the value is, in my opinion. And that is all not led by technology. That's not fancy engineering work. That's all user-centered design. That's about understanding the problem that you're trying to solve, understanding the people you're solving the problem for, and making sure that the solution not only works for the public, but also is adoptable, like Sara said, by the agency and maintainable. And so while I hire a bunch of fancy software engineers who are probably brilliant at developing in Go, mostly they build in Java, right? Because that's sort of the technical love language of government. Everybody sort of speaks it, and it works reasonably well with mainframes and with cloud-based sources or computing resources. And so the thing that ties that all together is the human-centered design element. And I really highly encourage people to lead with that and not lead with technology for technology's sake.
Yeah, and I think I can, roll in from the state perspective with, a real world example of that. We've had, unemployment insurance for a long time at the state. But what COVID really did was it put intense pressure on the efficiency of the registration process. We all of a sudden had, 5 million residents who needed to sign up for UIA in a very short period of time and recertify. So a process that could stand the kind of volume levels that we had pre-COVID with all the twists and turns and, click on this and fill out that and sign on here. And, once you sign on here, move over there. It just doesn't work at scale or at speed. And we actually ended up, doing a fairly fundamental, to Ed's point, it wasn't technology. We didn't do anything fancy with the UIA system. We streamlined the actual human experience process of signing up to make it easier, to make it faster, to make it more straightforward so that we could process 5 million people in a month. And it wasn't technology that did that. It was looking at, we actually had a design session where we actually walked through the process. And it's really in that cold light of day that you realize, it's kind of built up like many, many layers of varnish over periods of time. And it's been tolerated because only a small portion of our population actually had to experience it. And they generally aren't people who complain very much. And all of a sudden we had a new constituency that were thrust into this experience for the first time in their lives and found it wanting. And it forced us to really examine that and from the perspective of a new registrant for a service that had never done it before, and to actually walk their walk and understand how complicated it was and to actually straighten out a lot of the kinks in that. And that was taking it from a kind of a human-centered perspective and from the actual user experience and straightening that out and not necessarily bringing a whole bunch of technology to bear on it. And as a result, we had, like every state, we had our challenges at the start, but we were able to streamline the actual experiential process and make it, better for everybody. So learned a lot of lessons with that and kind of, cut our teeth as a state, down that human-centered design journey and showed some real benefit to taking that approach.
That's excellent. I love the walking their walk. Darryl, you talked a bit about human-centered design as well and how it helps your teams innovate. And can you speak to that from your perspective as well?
Absolutely. One of the things that we took some time in doing is the education part, and making sure that team members understood what human-centered design mean. And we decided to utilize a model from Stanford's design thinking approach. And the one thing that all of my impressive panel mates are articulating is the fact of empathy. being able to have empathy as you engage with your community, whether that is your user community or whether those are the humans that are on the other side of whatever interaction that you have with them. So as we look at doing that, being able to create personas that really resonate with those communities is important. The other thing that I've learned is that feedback is so important, and that's when we talk about understanding. What does understanding mean? And understanding is essentially looking at ways to better hear from those people that are dependent upon the services that you're providing. And one of the things that we utilize, and it really is a lot of different models, right? You can have interviews, you can do surveys and the like, but we utilize kind of a multi-approach where we look interviews, not only the product owners, but also the stakeholders, and then being able to utilize net promoter scores for those who are on the other side of that service, the humans on the other side of that service. I don't want to say just users, I want to say humans, because that is really where you get the most insight. And then utilizing an agile delivery approach, right? So whether you're utilizing a Kanban board or some level of agile processes, you can actually start building out your backlog based on certain features that weren't met in that initial rollout. So as we talk about releases and how we plan to release to these populations, that is something that we looked at as the feedback loop. So now you're able to track. So now your backlog and user stories actually are coming from those who are utilizing those services and solutions, which I think is critical towards getting to that human-centered element, as the panel members mentioned, not just about the technology, but also about the experience. And one of the things I would like to advise, if you have any questions about things or resources that you need, I just recently completed a human-centered design course with IDEO. So IDEO is a great resource if you plan to learn more about human-centered design, and they have a really impressive program. One of the use cases, and going back to a real use case, is how does the elderly interact with technology? Especially those who aren't digital natives and those who are in digital deserts. How do we really connect with them, and how do we provide them services? Whether it's completing their taxes, whether it's getting needed services for healthcare, how do we make that sure that experience is as seamless and reduces the friction as possible? So that one was two use cases that I think would be applicable as you start thinking about why this is an important topic.
Eddie, something that you said in your interview I thought was really interesting too, about looking at people that are considered to be problem people. Does that kind of ring a bell, and using them to really help you find better solutions?
Actually doesn't ring a bell, so I'm a bit at a loss. So I mean, I think that, like, this stuff it's hard, right? I think that one of the other themes, I think empathy is a great theme. I think another theme is you've got to get out of your office, right? You've got to go and you've got to meet people. Like, you can't, it's the number one thing I tell people to do, is like, if you were working on veterans homelessness, like, there's a veteran who's homeless on a corner in DC within a block of you. I guarantee you got to go find that person. You got to go talk to that person, because they've actually experienced the process and you understand like what it is. Because the answer is never like problem A has solution B. It's always like problem A is the outcome of what Anthony was saying, which is like just years and years of accreted process and problems, and you have to unpack that complexity into manageable steps. Like, you can't just, like, the unemployment insurance problem was a huge problem, one, because of what Anthony laid out, I think, very clearly, but also because Congress created a new program, right? Like pandemic unemployment insurance didn't abide by the same rules as unemployment insurance, and then they asked the states to implement this program, but you can't, like, they would have to actually like rewrite the way that the program works. So what you ended up happening, right, was like you had to prove that you weren't qualified for unemployment insurance to get pandemic unemployment insurance. And many states said, hey, what you need to do to prove this to us is apply for unemployment insurance and get denied, and then take a screenshot of the denial and send us the denial. Well, what did that do, right? You had hundreds of thousands of people in line. It added more people to the line, right? Instead of extracting those people out, you actually doubled down on the problem. And so, like, even from a policy perspective, nobody went out and asked the states, like, hey, if we invent a whole program from whole cloth and have you implement it under the most dire conditions, are you going to be able to do that? And the answer is no, or in most cases, no. And like, that's not on the states, right? That's on Congress. Like, they should not have proceeded that way. They should have asked questions first. But what I think I was trying to get at, and then maybe this will answer your question, is, oftentimes, like, there's just a person in the agency or in the state or in civil society, right, working at United Way, administering benefits, that knows there's a problem, right? Like, there used to be like system A used to talk to system B to get to system C, And then all of a sudden money ran out for system B. And so there's just somebody that manually like types the stuff from system A into system C. And that person's like a really, really valuable resource because they know what the problem is, but their identity is also wrapped up in being the person that can get things done, right? And so when you automate away that process, you deliver a whole bunch of value, except that you also automate away that person. So we look for those champions, like those are the people that can explain to us the crux of the problem. And if you can bring them along and help them, we bring them into the team. We encourage them to be part of it. We make them product owners as we transform from like sort of an outdated way of building products and services to modern service design, agile development, which Darryl mentioned. Then, you know, this person can come along and be the leader and the owner of that product. And those people are incredibly, like oftentimes they're seen as problem people because they're like the bottleneck because everything gets stuck in their desk, but they're oftentimes the smartest people when it comes to solving the problem because they viscerally understand what it is. And sometimes they raise their hand and say, this is a problem. And sometimes you got to go find them and build their trust. But either way, like that's generally where you, in my opinion, you want to start. And then you solve one of those pieces of complexity, which gives you the momentum to build the next piece of complexity. So you solve a problem this big to get the credit to solve a problem this big, to get the credit to solve a problem this big, and you work at it over time. There's a lot of value to be had, but you've got to bring those problem people along.
I love it. And I'll throw this question out to our other panelists. You touched on a few themes there, Eddie. You touched on the people that are actually involved in the transformation, as well as the people that we're serving. Any lessons learned, best practices around those things?
And Erica, is that to the rest of the panelists or back to Eddie?
Yes, that's to the rest of the panel. Yeah, I want to hear the different perspectives. Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things I'm trying to get to take root in our organization is we're all working at home right now. So we're not in our regular offices downtown or, you know, in these office complexes. So we're much closer to the residents and to the workers that we serve. And I think, you know, all of us at home are within a 5 or 10 minute drive of a transportation depot or a you know, driver's licensing office or health and human services office. While we're there, why not take the opportunity to go visit them, exactly to Ed's point, and look at how they operate, what they do in their daily lives, what their challenges are, and come back a little more informed as to what it really is like at the coalface of the services that we provide them. Because a lot of human-centered design correctly is focused on the resident. It's focused on the recipient of the residential service. But in internal IT, we also have a fairly large, you know, 50,000 people at the state, people who work with the stuff that we tell them that they have to use to do their jobs. And I think it behooves us as well to treat them almost as our constituents. And go and visit them. Go to a DNR campsite and ask them, like, what are your biggest challenges? And, you know, go to a Secretary of State office and watch them work and figure out how they actually interact with the systems and services that we provide them. One of the biggest risks, I think, when you do a lot of IT design and you do a lot of system deployment, is being the proxy user, you know, answering and human-centered design questions on their behalf without actually understanding what their lived experience is. And I think it behooves us to go out and actually observe them interacting with the systems. One of the 18F stories that gets told a lot is where, you know, they provided this wonderful travel booking system, and they went to visit the person who's meant to be using it, you know, several weeks later, and he says, "Well, how do you like it?" She says, "Oh, it's great. It's wonderful. I just enter in, where I want to book a flight to, and it comes up with all the prices and the itinerary and everything else, and I click it and I book it." And they looked over her shoulder, and it turns out she was using Google. She wasn't using the system that, you know, they designed for her at all, because she found a better path. She found a shortcut. And sometimes it behooves us to look over the shoulder and actually observe people in their daily work and figure out what they're actually doing to solve the problems that they face.
I really do value some of the insights that I shared, because as we talk about people in action and the people that we're serving, one of the things around teams, and this is project teams or agile teams, whichever approach you use, is to have buy-in and folks that understand the outcome and the desired outcome, but also what are the team norms and the values that we central around. Those are some things that are the starting place. One of the things that I worked with our teams on was developing a charter, because really is being able to look at the strategic themes and identify the outcomes that we are trying to achieve. I've seen many pilots and proof of concepts that would be executed just on the idea of a cool technology that we wanted to bring in, not understanding the overall impact that we are going to have. And being able to utilize those methods of surveys, interviews, and observation are really important, but they are part of the plan. So there are a certain amount of time that's allocated towards gaining those insights, and then there is a desire to execute or to move forward in that sprint. So being able to not only identify what the objectives are for the team, so the team knows and has a rallying call that they can move around, but also being able to understand those points in that process. And I mentioned design thinking earlier, in order to get those insights. In regards to feedback, one of the things that we utilized was Net Promoter Score, and being able to leverage Net Promoter Score on a broader scale, because it is primarily utilized for websites, but also being able to utilize it for services was very helpful. We use, I think, a form or some type of survey tool. But what it did was it helped us quickly identify systemic issues so that we didn't have to wait as long. So we created or shortened the time that it took to get input from not only the employees, but also from that stakeholder community or humans on the other side, but also being able to feed that back in to make sure that we are on point. The other thing is, what are some of the elements around culture that we have? Because you can have a great idea, you can have a great desire for execution, but if your culture does not support that particular change, does not support innovation, does not support agility, it will get some stumbling blocks. So leadership has a big role to play in our ability to execute certain functions in order to get to these ideal outcomes for human-centered design. So it's the cultural element is being able to understand the journey of the individual or the human on the other side, and then being able to execute as a team in order to achieve those desired objectives.
I would say, just to add, I 100% agree with everything everyone else has said, including sprints and buy-in from leadership and making sure that we actually get out there and speak to folks. But I think that one of the difficult things we've dealt with is we are strapped for time and resources in government, and how do we make sure that we continue to make progress on projects to continue to show our value. I think that when myself and my colleague started back in 2017, we were taking philo.gov out for a roadshow, and it was really, really hard to get buy-in from departments to come over to the platform. But now, we actively have the support of leadership and the mayor's office, and departments reach out to us. And what that does is it saves the city a chunk of money. It makes sure there's no security issues. It also makes sure the site's accessible from a variety of different ways. I think that really it's being able to move forward, make progress, prove your worth, but also make sure that you're not stepping on these subject matter experts that sit within departments or agencies or whomever you're working with. One of the other things we've been doing is looking at the passive data collection. So whether that be a product like Google Analytics or Microsoft Clarity, looking at how people use your sites, how can you continue to improve without actually speaking with folks and not relying on that? So that, I think, is one of the lessons learned that we're trying to continue to move forward with, in terms of always improving and looking at incremental changes and how we make sure we iterate on previous iterations.
Can I double click on that a little bit, because Sarah, you bring up an excellent point. When I think about government interaction, right, and think about the normal citizen, not us that are inside of federal and SLG services, but the citizen only engages with the federal government about 2 to maybe 3 times a year. And we know once a year it happens with the IRS, right? So when you get your taxes done, you have to interact with the federal government. Other times, maybe when you're trying to get a passport through State Department. or when you need a service. Unless you are in agriculture, unless you are in law enforcement, you don't have many interactions. So in order to get that feedback, we only get one shot per year to really see how that change has actually affected those who are dependent. So there are a number of things that we try to do, and you don't want to make assumptions as you engage with citizens, but there are certain assumptions that needs to be made because you just don't have the amount of engagement that, say, a Facebook or any social media platform has. They have daily interaction with their user base where the federal government or other governments have to do it based on the level of interaction, which is not as much. So that's something else to keep in mind as we continue to engage and try to improve services for the citizen. But it also gives us some key takeaways from those other services that do get the multitude of interaction.
I mean, there's a lot there. I'm like head is going in three directions. I would love to talk about Conway's law because I think that's actually the basis of fixing government. But it might be too esoteric. I actually think that like one thing, if we're going to talk about technology, one thing that we can talk about is just like improve your infrastructure, right? There's a lot of unknowns out there. Like the pandemic kind of proved that in a sort of unpleasant sort of way. But like there's a lot of mainframe infrastructure out there that is really good at doing what it does. Like to be honest, like I have spent 5 years in the depths of the federal government's technical systems, and I've come to appreciate a good, solid mainframe with some COBOL programming. It will do what it was told to do 40 years ago, every day from now in perpetuity. The problem is when you change things, right? And so this is, I think, one of the bigger, if we're going to talk about the actual technical problems we're trying to solve, one of the technical problems we need to solve is not knowing what's going to happen next. Right? It's not knowing what we're going to need to implement. And so to Sarah's point about like, you got to show progress, the best place in my opinion to invest is infrastructure. If you can move things up, you can, it's not just like lift and shift. If you can actually build your services and transform your services off of these sort of on-prem setups that people have, like this, where the hardware is owned by the government and like the guy that manages the hardware's pension is paid by the government, and the training for that guy is always like 3 years behind, and also it's always a guy, right? Into a modern technical infrastructure platform where, like a cloud-based platform where you can order a lot of the services. Sometimes it'll be more expensive, right? Like in a time like a pandemic, it'll get expensive, but then you get availability. Right? Like you don't have to build that in the moment. And then the times that you're not using it, like the IRS is not as busy in October as they are in April. That's maybe not fair. Maybe they're not as busy in August as they are in April. And so like being able to ramp down what you need at a time when you don't need it. I think that's really important because it goes to the heart of all of the things that we're facing, right? Like security. It's really, really hard. It is a more than a full-time job to keep up with modern technical security. You want a good team that does that. But like, it doesn't matter how great your team is if your infrastructure is terrible, if you don't have monitoring, if you don't have any way of knowing what happened, right? If you don't have a modern ticketing system, let's say you have 20 contractors and they all have their own instances of a ticketing incident. And all of a sudden now you need one contractor to be able to ticket something to another contractor, right? Like you need this to all to be in one modern environment. And so you can actually invest in these things. They will make your services faster. They will oftentimes make them cheaper except in times when you need them to not be cheaper, in which case you're really grateful that they're there. And they will also make it easier to shift and move as you go so that you're not locked into one person's vision from decades ago about what the service should be. Like the unemployment insurance system is a good example of that. We could have pivoted a lot faster if we didn't have to find COBOL programmers. We did a project at Medicare where we tried to modernize Medicare. And what we did is really clever. We built Java APIs on top of the COBOL mainframe. And then we extracted, because we're trying to do value-based care. It's like, we're trying to determine like how to pay a doctor for preventing cancer rather than sort of like palliative care for treating cancer for 20 years. Which is what we want, right? Like, but it's actually a much harder thing to do. And so we need more than the mainframe can provide. So we pull it out, we just do some fancy calculations in the cloud, and then we have to actually like send it back to the mainframe and like tell the mainframe what to do, but in a way that it thinks it's being told what to do in COBOL, but really you're writing it in Java. It's really sort of fascinating, right? You know what we found out? We found out you can do it. And then we did the time frame and the math, and we were like, okay, it's gonna take us like 20 years to do this. That's not so bad, right? Like Medicare is the largest payer in the world for health insurance. It's $2 billion a day, right? Like it can sink, if the Medicare system breaks, it'll sink the global economy in under a month. It's really scary. They're the basis for 17% of all US GDP. But here's the thing. We don't have COBOL programmers that can keep the old system running for 20 years while we fix it. Like, so the real problem here is ultimately that like we lack the ability to maintain these old things. So starting with infrastructure, you can start moving yourself into a position where you can not only maximize the immediate benefits of that, but you can put yourself in a position where you can hire modern technologists that can help you solve the problem faster. And it begins that element of accelerating change or exponential change rather than the sort of very gradual linear improvements that we can do.
And I think some of that infrastructure is not necessarily physical. It's not necessarily the classic infrastructure that we're talking about. One of the things that I wanted to highlight was the policy as code initiative that AT&F has been working on. A lot of the hard part for state governments about adapting to exactly the sort of changes that you were talking about, Ed, a new UIA program, a new benefits program, changes to the rules, is that we have to code that into our systems and then handle huge quantities of highly toxic data as we try our best guess at what the federal policy rules are. There's so many moving parts in there. We don't always get it right. And we try and approximate what the eligibility criteria are for UIA, for veterans benefits. We try and approximate what the federal definition of a veteran is. Right, and which campaign they were in, and accordingly which benefits they are available for. It's like this huge, expensive game of computer telephone, right? Where we're reading the policy, reading the guidelines, we're creating code that tries to attempt to recreate those in our own systems, and every time it changes, we have to write code again to actually do that. And that's why I'm really excited about this kind of policy of code that actually uploads a lot of that responsibility and responsibility for maintaining the true state of what the policy is to the people who actually create the policy, so that we can consume through service calls and that kind of thing. We can say, is this person a veteran, and simply get a yes or no answer, and which benefits are they entitled to, and get a list. And rather than having to handle all the data we need to munge together to try and guess our best guess at what the answers to those questions are. And I'm hoping, if we're talking about investment in infrastructure, that we can also talk about investment in sort of intellectual infrastructure or policy supporting infrastructure as well. Because that uploads a lot of the heavy lifting that the states and local governments have to do in order to interact with a federal policy and the administration of the federal programs.
I can't agree with that more. That's all I want to say. Like, I think Anthony is totally right. Like, the thing holding back society right now is separate definitions of what household means throughout the federal government. It's like destroying America. Like, that is so important to think about, like, those things, and that we shouldn't be putting the burden on states or counties or cities or nonprofits to try and sort these things out when we know that information exists somewhere in the system.
Yeah, because
Darryl,
that in turn makes that COBOL reprogramming so much easier. If all you have to do is turn your sort of state-owned COBOL system into something that consumes the responses to service calls from the federal government, you've really built in a kind of a future-proof lightness of code. And to me, it's almost as important as high-speed internet in rural areas. It is fundamental shift in our ability to accurately administer federal programs on behalf of our state residents. And I would really make a plea and a call for continued investment in that area, because it's absolutely vital, I think.
So Darryl and then Sara, I'd love your perspective on investing in infrastructure.
I'll let Sara go first.
I 100% agree with everything both Ed and Anthony have said it, but it takes a lot of effort and a lot of funding and a lot of understanding that resources. We're in the midst of moving a database application or mainframe application to, we're in the process of building it in-house. And this is a 20-year-old black screen with white letters on it. I'm not the most technical person. We have technical people for that. And that's, I think the best part about our teams is that they're multidisciplinary. So this project has been and will be a multi-year. It started off in our office of the CAO with the service design studio. They specialize in service design and research. And they spent a lot of time with the folks who use the tool, having conversations, understanding the flow, the process from end to end, and kind of figuring out what does this thing look like. We came in and basically got a bunch of information from them and then worked on how do we actually build this thing. We're in phase 1 and it's going well, but it's taking a lot longer than we expected because we keep on coming up with conversations. And I was in, I think, the first demo last week. And one of the things that, this is a frontline staff person who we've brought in as a core team member said, like, this is amazing. I can't wait to use this. And that's like what we've been waiting to hear for I think, a year now. But we're rolling out, this is our first application that we've done both front and back end for, resident facing and, for use of our department partners. So I think that doing projects like this and bringing these vendor projects in or projects that may not be built for your organization is really important, and making sure that the infrastructure and understanding from end to end is there. We're able to now tweak and improve on this thing, moving forward. And that's not possible. A lot of times you'll put out an RFP, 3 years later, folks will come back and say, here it is. And working in government, we know that a lot of things change over 3 years. I think that we do still face a lot of challenges around, I think, interfacing with these older and I guess less modern products. But I think finding these creative ways around either rebuilding them or figuring out how to maintain them and then make sure that they don't essentially die and we can still modify them is really important. So it's really, really important. I feel like we're on this kind of like precipice of, we are finally understanding that there are still some people who can kind of do this work, and we need to make sure we tap them right now and understand what are ways we can kind of leverage the work that's been done over the past years and move to a more modern, mindset.
So Darryl, did you want to answer that question as well?
Yes, ma'am, and I appreciate that, and definitely great responses. And one of the things that I think about is that, when I was enrolled at Homeland Security, one of the challenges is that we had two very, very large data center. One was a shared data center across the government. The other was a data center maintained by the agency. The challenge was the ability to spin up and down VMs in order to execute on certain functions or building applications, and also being able to leverage hyper-virtualization as a means of utilizing cloud-like services on-prem. The challenge became, were we supposed to be responsible for infrastructure, or were we supposed to be executing against a mission for our agencies? And that was a conversation that we were having. So in the Office of the CIO, it was saying, well, how do we lower the barrier of entry? Because there were different measures and KPIs out of our infrastructure associated with power, pick, and pipe that weren't really helping our components execute against the mission. And in some cases, there were certain blind spots that were identified that really did not help us have the governance that we needed to execute against it. So as I think about infrastructure, the desire that I had and the recommendations that I would make would be to ensure that those who are on the mission area don't have to worry about questions that should be provided by a service provider who can scale in order to meet the demand. So you hear about those stories of old where you had servers that were sitting on, data center floors for months or even years, unutilized because of the timing or the roadmap or whatever the case may be, or even the contract that was in place. So to me, when we think about infrastructure, it is saying, how do we best serve the individuals that are dependent upon those services? And how do we not necessarily say we're going to look at it from a monolithic lens, but how do we look at it from a open lens? So being, from Google perspective, we're very big on being open, right? Open source and having open environments. And when we have the conversations about hybrid and multi-cloud, we understand that there are different services that need to be rendered or utilized from other service providers. But how do we stitch it all together to unlock true transparency and insight and interoperability for that end user? So once again, it is about being able to maximize the user experience, not necessarily as focused on identifying the right infrastructure for those particular groups. The other is training and development, right? Our employees, so there was mention of finding COBOL developers and the like. From a training and development perspective, how fast can we resource these needed positions in order to meet the needs of our communities and of our humans on the other side? And that is something that we need to consider. And that is the justification for certain outsourcing of these requirements, because to manage them within government roles may not necessarily be as ideal long term, because we know that the scale is only increasing, not decreasing.
I love that. So we have time for one more question. So I'm just going to throw it to each of you. Any big lessons learned that you've kind of seen changed your opinion on over the years? Anything along those lines, best practices, lessons learned that you would share with other leaders and aspiring leaders trying to affect change for their customers, their teams, their organizations?
I think the big thing for me is always going back to the objective. In government, we love our paper, we love our processes. And what I try and remind people is every form, every gate, every check that we do at some point had a purpose. There was a reason why we decided we needed this form, or we needed this particular gate, we needed this particular approval. What happens is, over time, the original intent or the original objective of that form or checkpoint kind of gets lost in the organizational memory. And the form itself becomes the objective, right? And if you really ask people, what is actually this form for? What does this field do? Who uses this piece of data that we insist on collecting on the form? You sometimes encounter situations where nobody does. And we've encountered that a number of times during my career at the state. And I think what it is, achieving digital transformation and agility and modularity really centers on going back to the objective. What is your objective to ensure you have an accurate inventory of all your IT? Or is your objective to ensure spend control? Is your objective to ensure security of your deployed MIT? And then figure out how to do that if you were doing it from scratch today, using modern approaches, using modern technology, using modern architecture. How can you achieve that objective and without being constrained by the current process that you're engaged in today, without serving that process, but serving the ultimate objective instead? And to me, that's kind of the key of freeing yourself from the paperwork and the forms and the sort of linear processes that we have built up over time. And that's hard to do. And to Ed's point earlier, I mean, there are people in our organizations whose identity in their work is sustained by that process, right? And changing it and automating it and eliminating that affects the human people who come to our organization every day to work. So finding ways to do that and still give them, value and dignity in their role in the organization is the hard part. But that's kind of the key. It's freeing yourself from that kind of slavery to the process and to the form, and figuring out how to accomplish the ultimate objective in a different way, is a major step forward from a cultural perspective, I think.
And I actually will piggyback off of that, just to like plus one in that sense that, it's really building a culture that can question the current solutions or even the proposed solutions. If someone comes to you and says, I need a form to solve this really complex process, is that the best solution? How do you have a conversation with that around stakeholders? I think Anthony covered the objective really, really well, but it's in our nature to ask why in a way that's respectful and continuing to find like the true reason. We think about, how do you make sure you're building the right thing for that can live on and be sustainable for years to come? Because I think that everyone is now too smart to build things every year, and it's too many resources. So how do we make sure that this thing can exist, 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line? And just to pivot a bit, I think really it's one of the challenges we have in the city is hiring. We have a really hard time getting great designers and great software engineers. So we have instituted an apprenticeship program where we're actually bringing frontline staff, city employees. It's only open to city employees, and we're training them to either be a software engineer or user experience designer and work on our teams. And hopefully, after the apprenticeship tenure of 2 years, they'll be a designer that we have, capacity to keep on the teams. But we'll be also providing, the ability for them to get a position at another organization as a software engineer or user experience designer, making a salary more than they could have, with the city. So what that does for them is upward mobility in terms of equity and pay scales. But what that does for us is it really deepens the knowledge. I think the most useful resource at the city is the institutional knowledge of the people who have been in positions for 5, 10, 15 years and really understand the ins and outs of whatever exists. Sure, technology is a great solution. There, it can solve issues and problems, but I think that making sure we're not slapping it on to something that works really well, or making sure we're using it to, better the process is really, really important.
So as far as some remarks in regards, and I really appreciate the fact that Sara mentioned why, because I was going to recommend starting with why, right? So Simon Sinek has an excellent book that talks about that. So definitely recommend starting with why. Why are we doing this? Why are we talking about digital transformation at our agency or at our organization? Being agile and utilizing agile approaches. USDS has an impressive playbook that was created when I was in government. I'm not sure if it was updated, but it definitely holds tried and true to ways that you can actually incorporate a digital approach to your specific organization. The other thing is value diversity, right? And that's one of the things that we talk about. And even within Google, we have an Office of Ethical AI to make sure that, when we talk about solutions, especially around artificial intelligence, that it is including all communities and that it isn't restricting, because we understand that when there's certain blind spots there, it can create unanticipated issues. Value feedback. And so we talked about a number of areas where we can get feedback through interviews, through surveys, through observation that will really help you advance and develop better strategy going forward in utilizing strategic themes. Experiment, fail, and learn. So being able to experiment as much as possible, utilizing proof of concepts and pilot activities, and I say wrapped around KPIs, key performance indicators, so this way you know what you're working towards, and then leverage your resources. So many of you, and I'm so impressed with employees, being that I was on the other side, and I talked to so many companies, right? There's so many companies to keep track of. There's thousands of security tools and thousands of productivity tools, and many cloud tools, and being able to leverage those resources. So if you make an investment in a particular organizational company, utilize those resources. Have those experts come in and talk to you and let you know what's happening, because you can't keep up with every release, But if you are aware, that at least can go into the back of your mind saying, okay, well, maybe I should consider this the next go around. So those are my thoughts, and I really appreciate the time today. I really appreciate being part of such an impressive panel, and I'm looking forward to having more discussions like this.
I really enjoyed this. So yes, thank you. I agree with Darryl. Like, thank you everyone for coming to listen to us talk. But most importantly, like, I thank you to the other panelists and to Erica for putting this together. I will say, maybe I'll end on like what I've learned as a note of caution, which is, you know, we got to talk about fixing the procurement process, and we got to talk about like the hiring process and having great people. But there's not enough time for that. So I'll just leave you with this. Like, please don't forget about just pure qualitative feedback. Like, there are a lot of big data is the new snake oil salesman out there. Like, data is good. It tells you a lot about what you're doing and what you're not doing, but we're not Facebook, right? Like, we can't purposely or not purposely leave behind entire segments of the population. We're the government. We need to meet everybody's needs. And we do need to stop and check our assumptions. And so even though your numbers are going up, and even though you have a better net promoter score, and even though you have more people using your system, don't forget to take a minute and have an in-house person, like a user experience person, go and just do some research for the people that you fear or think or could potentially leave behind, and make sure that they're not the 2%, you know, 98% satisfaction score. But if 2% of those people are, you know, First Nations people, and like 100% of First Nations people are in that 2%, you are failing at your job, no matter how good your data is. And so just the ability to have a conversation, right? To stop. I mean, we did a project, we did a project, high stakes project. We did it very quickly, right? Like it was like we needed to get it done. And then the project ended, and we left behind the research, and we left behind the prototype, but we didn't have the time to go do that research. And even though the project was over, I remember telling the team that they had a month to just go and do the research and check all of their assumptions, that the things that they had to blow past quickly to get the thing done, because God forbid we handed over something that left someone out. And this is like a life or death sort of project. And so like, it is really, really important to think about like the actual humans in the process, and not just the numbers in the system that make up the human. And to get them, like, we record them, we ask their permission. And we, you know, when you need to win a debate about leaving somebody behind, being able to have them speak for themselves in front of a boardroom of people that are 17 layers of bureaucracy removed for them is a powerful thing. But we have the ability, and like that's the allure of government, we have the ability to help the people that need the most help, to reach the most marginalized, the people that like the actual like capitalist sort of society we have built doesn't have an interest in, right? But it's really, really easy in an organization this big to miss some of those people. And so take that time, make sure that person works for you and isn't a contractor and doesn't have any other objectives, that they're bought into your mission, and just invest in knowing who you might leave behind, because it will make for a better product for everyone, but it will also make for a better society.
What an awesome way to wrap up. Thank you so much, Eddie, Sara, Darryl, Anthony. You folks have been fabulous. There's also several resources that our panelists have put into the channel, into the chat window. So please check those out. Stu and Dan, I will turn it over to you for any last words.
Great. Well, I just want to thank everyone again for coming out today. And we'll get this video, I guess, I don't know if it goes on the ACT-I website or YouTube or somewhere, but we'll get it posted out there for folks to see. Thank you again, and we'll see everyone next month.
Yep. Hey, one last thing. Look for this panelist capability at ELC. Just another call out. I think it'll be a great opportunity to as a follow-on. And lastly, we will be pulling together as a deliverable a report that Erica is referenced early on. So look for that coming out as our deliverable out of our IT Management Modernization Committee. And there will not be a session next month because of ELC. but we will pick it up in December. Thank you. Thanks again, speakers. Appreciate it.
Thanks
Thank
for
you,
having
everyone.
us. All right, thank you.